Now that we've done deep dives on Sun and Moon, X and Y, Black and White, Diamond and Pearl, and Ruby and Sapphire, today we take the next step and cover Generation 2. I debated whether or not to make a deep dive on these games, given how much information is already known about the development, so instead I'll be focusing on the lesser known details, the stuff you might not have heard before, and provide my breakdown of the information. Let's start by talking about one of the biggest setbacks in Pokemon history, how Gold and Silver were delayed twice, and how development was almost completely restarted from scratch midway through. To really understand why Gold and Silver were delayed so many times, let's set up a timeline and refresh the context behind it. Pokemon Red and Green released in Japan on February 27, 1996. Just a few months later, in July of 1996, Game Freak announced that they were working on Pokemon 2, revealing Ho-Oh as one of the new Pokemon that would be featured in the game. Fast forward to April 1997, and Ho-Oh makes its first appearance in episode 1 of the Pokemon anime. Then in June 1997, the game was officially announced as Pokemon 2 Gold and Silver, with a release date set for the end of 1997. At this point, everything seemed to be moving forward. In September 1997, Famitsu confirmed that Pokemon 2 was still planned for a late 1997 release. But then in November, Game Freak brought a playable demo of Pokemon 2 to Nintendo's Spaceworld event. Despite the demo being compiled seemingly late into development, it was announced that Pokemon 2 had been delayed to March 1998, marking its first official delay. We're gonna revisit the Spaceworld demo a little later, but for now let's continue down the timeline. In December of 1997, a moment happened that almost ended Pokemon as a franchise, the infamous Porygon Flash incident. Due to the severity of the situation, the show was halted indefinitely, which had massive implications for the series as a whole. While there's no official confirmation, it's very likely that this impacted the rollout of merch and the development timeline of Pokemon 2, potentially messing with the initial release plans and marketing. By March of 1998, which was when Gold and Silver were supposed to release, Game Freak posted a formal apology to the Pokemon community and stated that Pokemon 2 was being delayed indefinitely because they simply couldn't complete the game in time. They cited multiple reasons, including an increased number of Pokemon, the addition of new mechanics, and developers becoming ill. On top of that, they stated that they wanted to release a product that was several times more powerful than what was shown at Spaceworld. We're gonna cover this part more in detail a bit later, but at this point, Pokemon Gold and Silver's development was practically restarted with a brand new vision, and it would be over a year before the public would get another major update. In May of 1999, CoroCoro magazine officially reintroduced Pokemon 2 as Pokemon Gold and Silver, revealing a new release date for the end of the year. Then in July of 1999, Pokemon the Movie 2000 was released, introducing Lugia, a Pokemon that was originally created as an anime-exclusive creature. But Lugia became so popular that Game Freak decided to add it into Gold and Silver at the last minute. Just a month later, Gold and Silver resurfaced at Nintendo's Spaceworld event in August of 1999, where it was reported that the game was now 90% complete. And then, after years of delays and major setbacks, Pokemon Gold and Silver finally released in Japan on November 21st, 1999. So that's the timeline. Now before we dive into the intricate details of a Spaceworld 97 demo, I want to take a moment to talk about the June 97 announcement of Pokemon 2 Gold and Silver, since there are some really interesting details here. First off, the reveal of a scrapped skateboarding mechanic originated here. It was stated that skateboards would be added alongside bicycles rather than replacing them, and that in Pokemon 2, riding a skateboard would take you to unexpected places. While there's no clear explanation of how skateboarding would be different from cycling, since it was meant to be an addition rather than just a cosmetic change, there's a good chance that it was originally planned as a unique gameplay function. Maybe it would allow players to access certain areas that bikes couldn't, or perhaps it had different movement mechanics altogether. Either way, it's fascinating that this was the very first new feature that they highlighted when introducing Pokemon 2 to the public, especially considering it was completely scrapped in the final game. The second major feature listed in the announcement was the introduction of new evolution forms for Pokemon. It first mentions pre-evolutions for Pokemon Red and Green species, which of course did make it into the final game, but there's a detail here that I think a lot of people gloss over. The announcement also states that some Pokemon that were supposedly in their final evolutionary stage would actually be able to evolve further in Pokemon 2. It specifically tells players to pay close attention to Pokemon that did not evolve in the first generation. Now we know that Gold and Silver did introduce alternate evolution forms for certain Kanto Pokemon, but only as alternatives to existing evolutions. However, this announcement doesn't say anything about alternate evolutions. It directly states that Pokemon that previously couldn't evolve would now gain entirely new evolutions. I wonder if the decision to give alternate evolution forms lies in the code behind Gold and Silver. Maybe Game Freak ran into issues modifying evolution data. It's an interesting thing to think about. The rest of the features in the announcement actually did make it into the final games, like the addition of an in-game clock, Pokemon eggs, and of course brand new creatures. The announcement also came with some very early images of Pokemon 2. In fact, these might be the very first public screenshots of the game. I think it's interesting to note that at this point, the graphics were the exact same as Red and Green, and along with that, there was this cool graphic showing how Pokemon 2 would connect with the original games. It's crazy looking back at these details, and seeing how some ideas evolved, while others disappeared entirely. Now that we've covered this, let's move on a couple months to the Spaceworld 97 demo, where we got an even deeper look at Gold and Silver's early development. The Spaceworld 97 demo is one of the most fascinating pieces of Pokemon history, giving us an early look at Gold and Silver before the game went through massive changes. And for years fans only had low quality footage and magazine scans to go off of, until the demo was eventually leaked in a Nintendo Giga Leak, giving us complete access to all of its content. We're gonna go through the most interesting changes compared to the final game, starting with the setting. For those of you that don't know, originally Gold and Silver wasn't gonna take place in Johto. Instead, the entire region was built off Japan as a whole. Kanto wouldn't have been a full region, but rather a single massive town that condensed its major landmarks into one big area. And if we scroll west, we'll find the starting town of the Spaceworld demo, which is also an early version of New Bark Town. It was actually called Silent Hills, which honestly still sounds like a Pokemon starting town name. The general layout is surprisingly similar to the final game. There's still 4 buildings, but the Pokemon Lab is located at the bottom right, while the Pokemon Center sits at the top right. Now it's a bit strange for a starting town to have a Pokemon Center, but I can see how it makes some sense, considering the 2 paths leading out of town. There's even a road heading east towards Kanto that seems to be blocked off, probably something that would have opened up later in the game. The fact that there are multiple paths branching off the starting town suggests that Game Freak originally intended for a more open world design. Compared to the linear structure of Red and Green, you'd likely have to backtrack through your starting town a couple times to reach different locations, which makes me wonder if their original plan was to let players explore this larger Japan-inspired map in a less restrictive way. It's an interesting design choice, especially as it seems like a natural progression to how Red and Green approach the start of a game. Yet most Pokemon games after still feature a linear starting route. Above Silent Hills, there's another town tucked into the woods, sitting just below what looks like the base of a mountain. If we keep heading north, we run into an area that was probably meant to be the original base of Mount Silver. The town below is mostly finished, and because it has an identical structure to the area on top, I'd guess that the town itself is the more polished design of the same area. Now if we head west, we'll get our first look at an early version of Ecruteak City, and this one has a much stronger Kyoto-inspired aesthetic. One thing that stands out is the rooftops. There's a lot more detail and variation here compared to the final game. Unfortunately, it seems like they had to scale back some of these more intricate designs, but at least the remakes later restored some of that original charm. Also, instead of 2 towers, there's just one large structure, and it's not burned down like in the final game. Moving further west, we arrive at a beta version of Goldenrod City. It's way smaller than what we got in Gold and Silver, but funnily enough, it actually feels like it could fit into the Pokemon timeline as an earlier, underdeveloped version of the Goldenrod we know today. And just like Ecruteak, the buildings feature completely unused tiles that didn't make it into the final game. The rest of the towns are seemingly complete, and many of them do feature landmarks from the final Johto region, like the Slowpoke Well, or some of the structures from the ruins of Alph. One really interesting location is this high-tech island. There's a building here that almost looks like an aquarium, and according to the demo data, this island was supposed to be the home of imposter Professor Oak, but we'll get back to him later. Right now let's keep focusing on the rest of the beta map. Since this whole map was based on Japan as a whole, this means that it would have included parts of both the Hoenn and Sinnoh regions too, right? Well, yeah. Here are the towns located in Hokkaido, which would later be adapted into the Sinnoh region. It's some incredibly fascinating pieces of scrapped content, because they're essentially official Game Freak adaptations of Hokkaido all the way back in the 90s. Moving all the way to the west, we get to the area based on Kyushu, which eventually became Hoenn. This part of a region has a much more tropical aesthetic, featuring palm trees and what looks like either a mountain range or pyramids. We've never really seen pyramids in Pokemon games before, but just imagine the kind of dungeons that they would have. Then there's this area, which lines up almost perfectly with where the region of Kitakami is speculated to be located. And it's a huge town surrounded by forests, with Pokemon roaming around in the overworld. Keep in mind we didn't get an adaptation of this area until the Teal Mask DLC. And I have to give a special mention to this spot, because it bears a strong resemblance to Canalave City. The layout is crazily similar, and I wonder if this means that Game Freak uses archived, scrapped town designs as inspiration for newer games, because if so, this might be the clearest proof of that. Now let's talk about some of the scrapped features from this build of the game. There are quite a few differences from a final version. The Elite Four had a completely different lineup. Instead of the team we got in Gold and Silver, it featured Giovanni, Bruno, Misty, and Lorelei. As far as I know, Giovanni and Lorelei weren't even present in the final games. There were also a few cut trainer classes which seem to be alternate spin-offs of existing ones, and interestingly, there are fully animated sprites for both Giovanni and Imposter Oak. For those of you that don't know, Imposter Oak was actually a scrapped villain from Gold and Silver. He would have been a character posing as Professor Oak in the story, and he was based on that high-tech island from earlier, but the entire plotline was scrapped. Despite that, the character still made his way into the Pokemon TCG, and even had a brief appearance in the Pokemon anime. Another interesting cut feature, there's an option that lets you name the player's mother, and it was probably meant to tie into the Pokegear's cell phone functionality, but it was removed from a final game. And here's a fun one. The game originally had a cut honeypot item, which was probably related to the scrapped sweet honey mechanic. Essentially, there's leftover dialogue in the beta builds that actually reference sweet honey as an item, even saying that you could use it on trees to attract Pokemon. The feature was ultimately scrapped, but then it showed up working in almost the exact same way in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. Following the showcase of the Spaceworld demo, it seems Game Freak was set for their release date of March 1998, just a couple months later. However, a shock announcement in early 1998 revealed that the game had been delayed indefinitely with no release date. It's noted that Game Freak wanted to create something much more ambitious than what they had shown at Spaceworld. While we don't know all the details, the development timeline strongly suggests that they almost completely restarted production at this point, something that's not too far-fetched to assume in game development. According to TCRF, the Japan region map was still present in the game's files until May 1998. Around that time, both the map and the Spaceworld Pokemon designs were internally backed up, which suggests that Game Freak had officially scrapped the original setting and begun work on the earliest version of a Johto map. During this time, they completely redesigned the Kanto and Johto layouts, essentially shaping the version of Gold and Silver that we know today. In the meantime, Game Freak went completely silent for almost a year, until they finally reintroduced Gold and Silver to the world in May 1999. Even then, Johto was still going through a lot of changes. The overall visuals were mostly locked in, but many locations across the region looked completely different from their final versions. It's honestly kinda surreal. These places feel so familiar, yet they have a totally different structure. I want to highlight Goldenrod in particular, because its evolution from a 97 map to this phase of development, then to the final game, almost creates a chronological order of how this city developed over time. It's like we're seeing actual in-game history of Goldenrod. And here's another cool one. The Lake of Rage was originally supposed to have a mini town and even a gym. I wouldn't be surprised if this was one of the ideas scrapped in favor of adding Kanto to the game. Kinda wish we had seen it return in the remakes. Of course, we have to take a look at the scrapped Pokemon designs, and Gold and Silver was certainly packed with them. Let's start with the original starter trio. Chikorita actually made it into the final game, completely unchanged too, which is really crazy when you think about it, as it still looks exactly like its original sprite. While the other two starters were completely different Pokemon, even Bayleaf had a totally different look. It makes sense why it was redesigned, as it really didn't fit with Chikorita or Meganium at all. Noctowl also looked way different, almost like an alternate version of a Pidgeline. This tells me that they directly built Hoot and Noctowl's designs directly off of a Pidgeline. At one point, there were pre-evolutions planned for Vulpix, Goldeen, Paras, Ditto, Doduo, Meowth, Ponyta, Grimer, Growlithe, Mr. Mime, Jinx, and Tangela. But that's not all. Tangela, Farfetch, Chansey, Pinsir, and Lickitung also had evolutions that never made it into the final game. Can't forget to mention the scrapped Grass-type evolution, which wouldn't resurface until Generation 4. A couple of special mentions, Pichu and Octillery both had some really early beta designs that looked way different from their final versions. There was also this cute scrapped Kotora line, and of course the original designs for the legendary beasts. And with that, we've pretty much covered all of the highlights from Gold and Silver scrapped content. If you guys enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.